Mark Twain Selected Works. Autobiographical Dictation of December 26, 1906. Peripatetic Phrenologist. In America, 40 or 50 years ago, Fowler and Wells stood at the head of the phrenological industry, and the firm's name was familiar in all ears. Their publications had a wide currency and were read and studied and discussed by truth-seekers and by converts all over the land. One of the most frequent arrivals in our village of Hannibal was the peripatetic phrenologist, and he was popular and always welcome. He gathered the people together and gave them a gratis lecture on the marvels of phrenology, then felt their bumps and made an estimate of the result at 25 cents per head. I think the people were almost always satisfied with these translations of their character, if one may properly use that word in this connection. And indeed the word is right enough, for the estimates really were translations, since they conveyed seeming facts out of apparent simplicities into unsimple technical forms of expression, although as a rule their meanings got left behind on the journey. Phrenology found many a bump on a man's head, and it labeled each bump with a formidable and outlandish name of its own. The phrenologist took delight in mouthing these great names. They gurgled from his lips in an easy and unembarrassed stream, and this exhibition of cultivated facility compelled the envy and admiration of everybody. By and by, the people became familiar with these strange names and addicted to the use of them, and they batted them back and forth in conversation with deep satisfaction. A satisfaction which could hardly have been more contenting if they had known for certain what the words meant. It is not at all likely, I think, that the traveling expert ever got any village's character quite right, but it is a safe guess that he was always wise enough to furnish his clients character charts that would compare favorably with George Washington's. It was a long time ago, and yet I think I still remember that no phrenologist ever came across a skull in our town that fell much short of the Washington standard. This general and close approach to perfection ought to have roused suspicion, perhaps, but I do not remember that it did. It is my impression that the people admired phrenology and believed in it, and that the voice of the doubter was not heard in the land. I was reared in this atmosphere of faith and belief and trust, and I think its influence was still upon me so many years afterward, when I encountered Fowler's advertisements in London. I was glad to see his name, and glad of an opportunity to personally test his art. The fact that I went to him under a fictitious name is an indication that not the whole bulk of the faith of my boyhood was still with me. It looks like circumstantial evidence that in some way my faith had suffered impairment in the course of the years. I found Fowler on duty in the midst of the impressive symbols of his trade. On brackets, on tables, on shelves, all about the room, stood marble white busts, hairless, every inch of the skull occupied by a shallow bump, and every bump labeled with its imposing name in black letters. Fowler received me with indifference, fingered my head in an uninterested way, and named and estimated my qualities in a bored and monotonous voice. He said I possessed amazing courage, an abnormal spirit of daring, a pluck, a stern will, a fearlessness that were without limit. I was astonished at this, and gratified too. I had not suspected it before. But then he forged over on the other side of my skull and found a hump there, which he called caution. This hump was so tall, so mountainous, that it reduced my courage bump to a mere hillock by comparison, although the courage bump had been so prominent up to that time, according to his description of it, that it ought to have been a capable thing to hang my hat on. But it amounted to nothing now in the presence of that Matterhorn which he called my caution. He explained that if that Matterhorn had been left out of my scheme of character, I would have been one of the bravest men that ever lived, possibly the bravest, but that my cautiousness was so prodigiously superior to it that it abolished my courage and made me almost spectacularly timid. He continued his discoveries with the result that I came out safe and sound at the end with 100 great and shining qualities, but which lost their value and amounted to nothing because each of the 100 was coupled up with an opposing defect which took the effectiveness all out of it. However, he found a cavity in one place, a cavity where a bump would have been in anybody else's skull. That cavity, he said, was all alone, all by itself, occupying a solitude, and had no opposing bump, however slight in elevation, to modify and ameliorate its perfect completeness and isolation. He startled me by saying that cavity represented the total absence of the sense of humor. He now became almost interested. Some of his indifference disappeared. He almost grew eloquent over this America which he had discovered. He said he often found bumps of humor which were so small that they were hardly noticeable, but that in his long experience this was the first time he had ever come across a cavity where that bump ought to be. I was hurt, humiliated, resentful, but I kept these feelings to myself. At bottom, I believed his diagnosis was wrong, but I was not certain. In order to make sure, I thought I would wait until he should have forgotten my face and the peculiarities of my skull, and then come back and try again, and see if he had really known what he had been talking about, or had only been guessing. After 3 months, I went to him again, but under my own name this time. Once more, he made a striking discovery. The cavity was gone, and in its place was a Mount Everest, figuratively speaking, 31,000 feet high, the loftiest bump of humor he had ever encountered in his lifelong experience. I went from his presence prejudiced against phrenology, but it may be, as I have said to the English gentleman, that I ought to have conferred the prejudice upon Fowler and not upon the art which he was exploiting. 11 years ago, on board a ship bound for Europe, William T. Stead made a photograph of my right hand, and afterwards in London sent replicas of it to 12 palmists, concealing from them my name, and asking them to make and send to him estimates of the character of the owner of the hand. The estimates were furnished, and Stead published 6 or 7 of them in his magazine. By those estimates, I found that my makeup was about like anybody else's. I did not seem to differ much from other people, certainly in no prominent and striking way, except in a single detail. In none of the estimates was the word humor mentioned, if my memory is not mistreating me, except in one. In that one, the palmist said that the possessor of that hand was totally destitute of the sense of humor. 2 years ago, Colonel Harvey took prints of my 2 hands and sent them to 6 professional palmists of distinguished reputation here in New York City, and he also withheld my name and asked for estimates. History repeated itself. The word humor occurred only once in the 6 estimates, and then it was accompanied by the definite remark that the possessor of the hands was destitute of the sense of humor. Now then, I have Fowler's estimate. I have the estimates of Stead's 6 or 7 palmists. I have the estimates of Harvey's half-dozen. The evidence that I do not possess the sense of humor is overwhelming, satisfying, convincing, incontrovertible. And at last, I believe it myself.